Your Eminences, Your Eminence, dear guests, dear friends of the Center of Ecumenical, Missiological, and Environmental Studies, good evening. Today is a very particular lecture, I would say. Sorry for the delay, but I couldn't stop the discussion before because we have with us the Archbishop of Ottawa, Lazar Puhalo, Very Reverend Puhalo, His Eminence. I will talk about the unity requires diversity, the rebirth of synodality. And this is in our lectures on synodality yesterday and today. The integration and some interdisciplinary approaches as well. If I have to present His Eminence, even though, you know, in the discussion we had, he states that he's a retired hierarch. I think that once a bishop, always a bishop. But yeah, so he was an hierarch in the Orthodox Church in America and founding abbot of the Monastery of All Saints of North America and Canada. Again, his books worth more than an hour to talk about them. I'll just stand the 2, 3 I have chosen, which are my favorite ones actually: The Soul, the Body, and the Death by CEMES Express in 2010, Thinking Theologically, The Mystic and the Lawyer. And we had also the pleasure, which also was also a tribute to His Eminence for his devotion to His All Holiness, Patriarch Bartholomew, and his initiatives, as well as CEMES gratitude to him for editing and publishing our last ecumenical book, titled For the Unity of the One Church of Christ. But today the subject is different. We're going to talk about synodality. So, Your Eminence, we're looking forward to listen to you. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
When Pope Francis introduced the idea of returning to the ancient system of synodality, it set off a firestorm in the West, and that's continuing to this day. Well, some of our colleagues here have already reminded us that the Church began synodos, walking together. But when it came necessary to replace Judas, evidently the Church very small, the whole Church came together in a general synod and they elected Matthias. When it came time, the apostles wanted to teach more than serving tables. Then they called the Church together in a synod and said, look, why don't we appoint servers, diaconate, and we'll give ourselves over to the teaching of the gospel. So they voted and said, yes, resolved that at a synod. But for us, the most important early synod was at Acts 15, when Apostle Paul came down to the apostles, and all of a sudden we had this huge diversity, this huge difference in the way Christianity was being presented and understood. So that had to be resolved some way. Could you allow Apostle Paul to be different from the church in Jerusalem? Because he's speaking now in the Greco-Roman world, and he's speaking to Greeks, and you don't get the average 30-year-old who's willing to be circumcised. So that had to be resolved at a synod. And Apostle Paul went to the synod, didn't take a unilateral decision, and the synod spoke. James apparently was the president of the synod. There was always a synodiarch, and they gave a decision and allowed, okay, there's certain what to them are very serious doctrinal matters. You couldn't have fornication or eat things that were strangled or partake of food that was offered to idols. And so those few things were retained, but they understood that in order for the gospel to increase and encompass the world, they were going to have to allow for the diversity which Apostle Paul had to present for the Greco-Roman world. Within the framework of the doctrine and the unity of the church, you could allow for certain differences. Now, in the West in particular, the synodality had disappeared, largely because of the political circumstances after the fall of Rome, when the church in Rome had to assume the responsibility for maintaining all the culture and education, some kind of unit, holding the whole of society together in a way. And you couldn't have working synods in under each of these warlords, these little principalities. So everything became more and more centralized, Some kind of epistasia in the center was dictating to everyone. And you tried to keep things together by conformity was so important. Now, the Pope now realizes that there's a real problem with this. You know, after the Gregorian reforms, everything was centralized. We talk about a Judeo-Christian culture. It doesn't exist. It was an invention of following the Second World War mainly, because of the Holocaust, you know, we had to have something Judeo-Christian. We have a Greco-Roman culture with a veneer of Christianity, an overlay of Christianity, deeply affected by Christianity, but we still have a Greco-Roman culture which seems to occupy the whole church. And we're also have a problem of the kind of deep apocalyptic sense. It's almost cult-like. And it's within the Orthodox Church, within the Evangelical Church, both. We passed canons in the ancient times that always presupposed the earth wasn't going to last very much longer. So we had formed a kind of from a Greco-Roman point of view, a purity cult, or a purity, cult is the wrong word, but sect. And then we go to other countries, we dictate to them from the center, but we don't coordinate, we don't have consultations with them. Supposing, for example, the people in Africa who have become Orthodox were forbidden to dance in church. They do after Pascha, especially. Very exuberant dancing. It's part of their culture. It's not part of our Greco-Roman culture, so we find it shocking. But we don't consult with them. We just dictate from headquarters. Fortunately, we haven't fallen into that demanding absolute conformity. But throughout the history of the church, we've had always local synods and then pan-Orthodox synods. And the local synods are a consultation with the people in local cultures and local groups. Then we have a pan-Orthodox synods, most of which are ignored after they're over with. The great synod of Pan-Orthodox Synod of Moscow that ended in 1667 forbade any portrayals of God the Father or the Holy Trinity, and reminded people that all the Old Testament theophanies were God the Son, not God the Father. But didn't change anything. Everybody still went on painting icons of God the Father and thinking that the Ancient of Days was God the Father. The Synod of Yash, I think it was 1903 or 1905, absolutely forbade changing the calendar. 4 other local synods had also forbidden this. One pan-Orthodox synod in Constantinople. Well, there were consultations, but we heard the input from people in different cultures and different locations and different places. And when synodality passed away in the West in particular, you didn't have a real input or consultation from the local countries where you were dealing with, the local cultures where we were dealing with. And very often we get the thought, well, the local cultures have to change. They have to become Greco-Roman like us, or Christo-Judaic, as we like to say. Even when the Pope wanted to have a married priest in the Amazon River Valley, there was a great protest against that, even though locally, the synods locally realized that was really necessary for that particular area, that particular culture, and the particularities of how they viewed interhuman relationships. Today in Africa, many of the Western Rite priests are married and have families, maybe common law marriage or civil marriages, because their culture finds the celibacy like that shocking. They find it abnormal and unacceptable. But what kind of consultation do we have with that culture or that community? So Pope Francis was trying to restore synodality so that there could be consultations and inputs from different cultures in different places, and realize and recognize the diversity that was necessary, because when you try to demand absolute conformity and force everything from the center down, you have people breaking apart, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, but you have divisions forming in the church because you don't allow for the diversity of communities and the diversity of understandings. And of course, God forbid that we should come into conformity with the knowledge of modern science or modern medicine. We have no way of having, without local synods, we have no way of having information flowing upward into the center when they make decisions. So the Pope Francis saw the reality of that and wanted to restore the whole idea of local synods. But when you're restoring something ancient that's fallen out of use, everybody thinks it's an innovation. Oh, he's innovating. He doesn't want, they want the Pope to be absolute ruler. But then when he makes a decision, all of a sudden they don't want him to be absolute ruler. They want to question him. But the value of having synodal units in different countries and consultations with those local synods flowing into the center again with information consultations was demonstrated recently by the Pope had to interject in a synod in Germany. But if you didn't have a synod in Germany where decisions were being taken in common, they would have been taken on a parish-by-parish basis, and you would have more and more disunity taking place. Okay, the Pope set limits on what the synod in Germany could do, but on the basis of doctrine of the church and doctrine and order. But without that interaction between the local synod and the Vatican, a disunity would have taken place. Diversity would have taken place anyway. Here you have some kind of an organized recognition of diversity. And because you have the synods locally feeding into the general church synods, you know what's going on in different places, and you know what the stresses and problems that are taking place in different places. But you find if you try to have absolute conformity, if you try to want everybody to be cast in the same mold, then disunity does set in, and often it's beneath the surface and you can't see it. But these tensions and stresses are pulling apart at the church because people in different cultures and locations and different, whether they've come from having a medieval mindset to having a 21st century mindset, they're going to follow what's necessary locally anyway, but there's going to be no infeed into the church center. So there's a pulling apart because you haven't taken hold of this diversity and said, yes, there is diversity. We can recognize diversity, but here are the boundaries, the doctrinal boundaries on it. And this is one of the things that Blessed Pope Francis, I dare say Blessed Pope Francis, is trying to remedy. In the Orthodox world, synodality has always been a part of our structure, theoretically. Only theoretically, it hasn't worked. And we can see the divisions that have been created within the Orthodox world because we don't have practice an effective synodality. It might be unfortunate that we have so many local patriarchs instead of having a college of metropolitans instead, because then each patriarch feels that he's sort of an absolute head of an absolute unit. And they very often don't recognize the need for the presidency of the ecumenical patriarch and don't see the need always to respond when he wants to have a pan-Orthodox synod, general synod, to resolve these differences that are building up year after year after year. And without the consultation, we find that there are political influences in the local churches. Rome finds this as much as we do, and the Pope recognizes this, that draw us apart more and more. And when we're not consulting together in a synod, or a pan-Orthodox synod, and bringing the input from local synods into this pan-Orthodox synod to inform what's going on worldwide and what the stresses and tensions are worldwide, so they can be resolved by the whole of the church, not piecemeal, one jurisdiction, another jurisdiction, going in different directions. We understand there has to be diversity because we have diverse cultures, diverse histories, diverse national traditions, and diverse understandings of the world itself. And unless we can get together and discuss these things in a synod, prayerfully and within the context of understanding the church as a body of Christ, which is kind of a metaphysical abstraction in itself, which is not very well explained. One thing that, and I'm going to look at us instead of Rome right now, one thing that I've found in all the years that I've been lecturing practically all over the world is that even the sacraments are understood in different ways in different churches. You know, I wrote the book about the sacraments just because I found that not just diversity, but sometimes radical misunderstandings about what the sacraments mean, what they accomplish. Of course, the Orthodox Church has no doctrine of 7 sacraments. We have, anytime the people of God are gathered together with their priest to call down the grace of the Holy Spirit, to bless, to sanctify, to consecrate, it's a sacrament. But when a young couple came to me some years ago from the university, they wanted to get married in the Serbian church, and they would have a lot of non-Serbian people coming to the wedding. How do we explain to them something about what does the marriage mean? And I said, well, you talk to your pope about it, your priest. The young lady said, oh, I asked the priest, and he patted me on the head and said, don't worry your sweet little head, we'll do it properly. That's all he said. Okay, I was looking into writings about marriage and the teachings about marriage. Marriage had been reduced down to sex. Sex is okay if you have that paper. Sex is not okay if you don't have that paper. And that's about all that it meant to most people. Well, very elaborate ethnic ritual, but it was all about whether it was okay to have sex or not. Now, that literally is what it had been reduced down to in most people's minds. So it was necessary to really begin to explain, why is marriage a sacrament if it's just about sects. It became a sacrament only in the 1200s in the West. And as Taras Kurgansky points out, it was probably the 1700s before it was actually listed as a sacrament in Russia. We're talking about sanctification, consecration, and blessing. We're not talking about ethnic rituals, but in so many cases, somebody who doesn't go to church regularly will go to the metropole in Athens. Oh, we want to have an Orthodox wedding. Why? Well, it's traditional, customary. The Yaya and Papu want it. And really, we're not teaching people these things. And the fact that they're not being taught throughout the world is something that should be taken up at a general council of the church, at a synod, and discussed at a synod, and solutions should be discussed at a synod. They shouldn't be left to each individual priest or each individual bishop to make up some explanations. It should be done in a Holy Synod. And that's why we need to have these regular synods, but not just, we have a synod of bishops in Russia, a synod of bishops in America. We're discussing different things. We're pulling apart in different ways because we don't come together finally in a pan-Orthodox synod and take the input of all these local synods as advice and consultation with the local communities and people. One of the things about Pope Francis' idea of synodality is it's including lay people more broadly and including women, thank heavens, so that we have an input from a greater spectrum of society and of cultures. And we hear what the problems of the lay people are. Myself and Reader Irini, we have these discussions about deconstructionism. Well, it's going on in the Orthodox Church also. People want answers, they don't want slogans. And they're not getting them. But perhaps it's because there's a difference in understanding in different places in the church. One book published explaining marriage was, why do we use the crowns in the marriage? Because it symbolizes that the husband and wife are now king and queen in their own little kingdom, the home. And the cross procession around the gospel is now Isaiah's dance. Their first dance together as husband and wife. These are the explanations they're receiving. These are things that need to be discussed seriously at synods. And we need to find out, well, are these things being understood differently in one country, differently in another country, differently in another society and culture? You can only resolve those things if you come together in a synod to discuss them. And local synods have to feed into a general synod where decisions can actually be taken that affect the whole church. And somebody says, oh my goodness, is baptism more than dunking a baby 3 times underwater? Does it do anything? Does it accomplish anything? Does it mean anything? Is it an ethnic ritual? Is it just something you do because Baba and Jita want it done? And we've had that. Ukrainian couple came here, wanted an Orthodox wedding. It's, well, but which church you go to, you should have it done by your own priest in your own church. Oh, well, we don't actually go, once in a while we go to the United Church. Why on earth do you want an Orthodox wedding then? Well, Baba and Jita, Grandma and Granddad, we want to please them. That's the reason you want an Orthodox marriage. But that's the best you've been taught. And the fact that this is disparities. Now, this is not diversity of communities and societies and cultures. This is a breakdown in the essential understandings of the liturgical life of the church and of the idea of consecration and sanctification through the holy mysteries of the church. Even the divine liturgy itself is seldom understood by very many people in the church because seldom explained. And sometimes we need to really adjust these divine services. There's no reason the liturgy has to take 3 hours in the morning, or with matins at 4 hours in the Russian style. And before long, no young people are coming to church because it's too much for them. They're exhausted. They can't focus that long. They don't have that attention span. And why is that? Because of technology has caused an evolution of the human brain. So a younger generation are evolving mentally under these pressures of technology, science, and we're not responding to it. We're pretending it doesn't exist. We still have some elders around saying evolution is not true. There's no kind of evolution at all. And yet these evolutionary changes are taking place around us. And how can we respond to them? Does it have to be one priest responding differently than another priest? Or can we have a synod meeting together to discuss these problems and take consultation from the actual people themselves? So when, my first teacher was Father John Romanidis, and he used to say, the main characteristic of Orthodoxy is long robes, long beards, and long services. And we can't respond outside of that framework. One of the things that I'm sure Pope Francis is getting at, and one of the things we need to look at in the Orthodox world, is to have a synod at which we have experts speaking in different fields and bringing us up to date in different things. I once went to the cathedral in Boston. I was at a conference at Holy Cross. Went to the cathedral in Boston, and there was, during coffee afterwards, there was a table that had university students and some senior secondary school students. And I went to talk to them. They knew my background. So we spent a whole hour talking about cosmic string theory. See, they didn't want to hear about what I call metaphysical abstractions. They wanted to hear cosmic string theory. They wanted to hear, how does this impact us? What does this say to our faith? How do we respond to these medical developments, these different neurobiological developments? How do we respond to an answer? What impact technology is having on the human brain? What impact is it having on a younger generation who were born and raised in a technological age? And I found this time and time again. I spoke a lot in Romania universities and down in America, the country down below us. And the questions that the students posed to us, I realized that they needed to be collated and they needed to be brought to a synod of some kind so there could be a synodal response to them, but not a synodal response to a bunch of old men with beards. A synodal response that included medical experts, somebody that had neurobiological understanding, somebody that had scientific knowledge and could respond in a way that actually meant something, a theology of reality, an existential theology. I don't mean changing doctrine or changing dogmas of the church. That's set by the symbol of faith. But we do have a lot of Iron Age ideas that we think are absolute dogmas. We have a lot of medieval mentality and ideas that we think are absolute, must be defended as tradition. Well, this is tradition. Well, tradition since when? Since 1200. I've attended the conferences on transhumanism and futurism to understand how people were guiding the technology that we're developing in relation to the human person. And we can't just answer and say, oh, this is bad, this is sinful, this is no good. We have to have concrete reasons. We have to have explanations why we don't accept it, why it's not good, how this transhumanist movement and how artificial intelligence is actually impacting human beings, actually impacting our daily lives, actually impacting our faith as Orthodox Christians. You have to resolve those things at synods. But they can't be synods of a bunch of old men who want the status quo. Synodality has now to include the input, understanding the diversity of our humanity, the diversity of our cultures. They can't all be responded to in exactly the same way. We have to allow for that diversity. Actually, if we don't allow for diversity, we can never have any meaningful dialogue between the two sisters, between Rome and Constantinople. I call them the two Catholic sisters. If we don't allow for the diversity of each other. But it's a little bit larger now than just saying, well, the Melkites have to serve a little bit different than the Latin Rite, or you have to allow some difference for Native peoples in Alaska or for people in Africa who are going to dance in church because it's an intense part of their culture. You have to have a synods that are willing to deal with the realities of the world in which we live, that have to have somebody with some input. Artificial intelligence is not benign. It affects our Orthodox Christian children, our Orthodox Christian youth. How can we respond to it piecemeal? We have to respond to it by synods, and the synod has to be called not for the purpose of what some of our synods are called for, just maintaining traditions. They have to be called to deal with constantly arising realities of human existence. And they have to be called with an understanding that we're not going to put everybody into the same mold. We're not going to be able to give a single answer that's going to affect every culture. We're going to have to allow for the diversities in education, in ways of looking at things. Sometimes one of the bishops from Canada goes to this Sanhedrin that they have down in America, the Council of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, and he comes back and tells me, when we listen to the American bishops, it's as if they're speaking a different language than us. We're speaking English, but we don't mean the same things at all, because we have a different culture up here, and our responses are somewhat different than they would be in America, where they're much more subverted by their national state. I mean, the religion of America is not really Christianity. The religion of America is America. And we're struggling to keep Christianity alive in that context in the United States. So these diversities occur. We have to recognize them, and we have to embrace them and say, well, diversities are fine. Otherwise, things are going on under the surface that we don't see, and we're pulling apart and getting more and more disunity, more and more disharmony, and more of a lack of being able to understand each other. And so that's what I have to say about the synodal system. Is it's wonderful that Pope Francis is trying to introduce it in the West. I discussed it 2 weeks ago at the Benedictine Abbey with some of my brothers up there. Some of them are very distressed and disturbed about the idea of synodality, the idea of lay people being able to have a voice and speak, of a consultation around the world, and with every local and everything coming from the local synods into a general synod, into a pan-Orthodox synod, which should be held probably every 3rd year, maybe every 5th year, and to have the input from all of the local synods, but to start realizing that we have to have people who know what they're talking about speaking at these synods. And I know theologically a lot of people are brilliant. They know what they're talking about, all this. A lot of people are well-grounded in Maximus and Simeon the new theologian and all. But a theology of reality has to be brought out at these synods. And they can only be resolved in synods. It's not wise or useful to let them be resolved piecemeally, one diocese, another diocese, a different opinion, different point of view, a different approach. We need to, while allowing for diversity within the framework of Orthodox Christian doctrine, but we need to understand what's going on in every location in order to have these things voiced, to have some input, some consultation, so that under the cover, what we don't see, a real division is developing. And when we try to say, oh, these divisions are developing, we have to have conformity, we can't allow diversity, we only increase the divisions and the divisiveness. So I would really support Pope Francis's attempt to reintroduce real synodality in the West, while at the same time telling us that we need to restore our concept of synodality. It's not right that the ecumenical patriarch should call a pan-Orthodox synod, and some people say, well, I'm not going to show up. I don't like what he thinks, so I'm not going to show up. I'm not going to have any input. I'm not going to be there to say what I think. I'm just going to go off and solve my own problems completely in isolation by myself. Our jurisdiction, I mean, the refusal of people to show up at Great Tea was shameful. They want to complain, but they didn't want to have input. They didn't want to recognize the synodality of the church. And that's part of why we are developing. Sometimes we don't even see the cracks in the glacier, but we're developing divisions, and not, first of all, embracing the diversity of countries, and cultures, and even various locations. There have to be diverse solutions to local problems sometimes, but they have to be discussed within the context of synodality, of synods, so that we don't have divisions developing unseen and unheard, unknown, and suddenly we wake up and find all of these divisions taking place. It's to such a degree that is the only solution to the Ukrainian church aspirations to try to commit genocide against the Ukrainians, sponsored by the Moscow Patriarchate, because they have ownership of Ukraine. They have ownership of the Ukrainian people. They have ownership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. And how dare they express their need for the diversity between Ukraine and Russia? That's a case in question, because here you have to have a diversity. Despite the delusions of Moscow, Ukraine and Russia do not have the same cultures. Exactly. They have some historical precedents, but they don't. They're different cultures. They have to have different responses, different solutions. So the idea of, instead of getting together with the Pan-Orthodox Synod, discussing these things out, start dropping bombs on people, on your own Orthodox Christian brothers. That's the extent to which it can go when you're not consulting together, when you're not meeting together, when you're not synodos, when you're not walking together any longer and discussing and trying to iron out these various problems. When I was I was a voting delegate at the Synod for the founding of the Ukrainian Autocephalous, trying to unify it. And among other things, in certain parts of Ukraine, people would, well, why do we belong to the Russian Orthodox Church? We have a Ukrainian Catholic Church. Let's start going to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. At least it's Ukrainian. At least it speaks our language and allows our language, allows our customs, allows our local traditions. but they're forbidden by the overlord. We can't allow this diversity to take place. Everything has to be po naszemu. Everything has to be our way. You can't have your cultural diversities. And you can't meet together in a synod to discuss these things. The synod would have to be a pan-Orthodox synod, should be presided by the ecumenical patriarch, not somebody else, not any other patriarch. I mean, remember, Serbia got a patriarch through blackmail. I mean, blackmailed Constantinople to get a patriarch. But trying to revisit our own Orthodox understanding of what synodality is. It's not a bishops, priests getting together, and sometimes lay people, to talk about really some of the problems that are talked about are abstractions. And you say, well, this is tradition, we want to enforce tradition, but what is sacred tradition, what is tradition has to be discussed in a synod. What it applies to Galicia doesn't necessarily apply to Kiev. And synods are the only way to discuss these and to bring about any unity and understanding through the acknowledgement of diversity, but through the acknowledgement of the fact that knowledge and understanding has changed and transformed the way people think, the way people react, the way they approach problems and address problems. I was thinking when I had a friend in the Irish Orthodox Church, there is one, the Irish Orthodox Church, when they voted in Ireland to accept abortion and same-sex marriage, he said, I didn't vote for either one of those. I voted yes, but I wasn't voting for either one. I was voting against the Roman Catholic Church. And that's something that, okay, how little influence the Greek Church had on the state when it came to legislating for same-sex marriage. And I don't know what the status of abortion is in Greece. I know the rate of abortion is fairly high there, but I don't know how the law views it. Why did suddenly the church could have all this protest, but they didn't have real influence? Why would the government say, look, you preach, we legislate? Why did the government have 55% approval from the people, and the church had 45% approval? It has to be that there's a big disparity forming. There's a big division forming between the general populace and the Orthodox Church in Greece. Because the Orthodox Church in Greece is living in yesterday. Not sacred tradition, but yesterday. And unless you have a council come together that can freely and openly discuss these problems, a real synod, like the synod in Jerusalem, Acts 15, who could say, does everybody need to conform exactly to this? No. But here's what they have to conform to. Here's what they can have diversity in. And the church isn't giving real answers to many of these questions. And to come up with piecemeal answers, one diocese answering it this way, another this way, another that way, and there's no general discussion of what these responses should be. It's not diversity, it's division anymore. And then we have to have a synod that says, well, why is the church having so little impact? Where's its moral authority gone? Why is its moral authority bleeding away? What are we not doing that we should be doing? And what are we not teaching that we should be teaching? What are we not learning that we should be learning? And these things can only be resolved in a structured hierarchy of synods. And that's what Pope Francis is trying to accomplish, much to the hysteria of the ultra-conservative people. In the Orthodox Church, much to the consternation of the ultra-traditionalists. And I don't remember exactly who said it, but tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And sometimes we're bogged down in traditionalism. And unless we get together in these synods, unless we have these general discussions and accept the input from every area, every region, every culture, every stress point in the world, we can't really resolve what is tradition and what is just traditionalism. And traditionalism is one of our problems. Traditionalism prevents us from coming into the context of the realities of human existence, of the new knowledge, the new understandings that we have in neurobiology and medicine and science that contradict some of the ideas and theological philosophies of the 1200s or the 500 BC or AD of the medieval era. And we're still bogged down in all those things. And each diocese is left to fend for itself in trying to resolve how to deal with them. Unless we have real synods, effective synods that are meaningful, that are going to be consultative, that are going to feed into the greater picture of the life of the church. We need a universal definition of even what the sacraments mean, and especially marriage. 45%, according to our statistics, of Canadians are going to live together and have children together. They have no intention of getting married. A common law marriage, of course, is legal. You just live together for 2 years and that's it. But a church marriage, well, I mean, that's just an ethnic ritual. You just go in and they plop these crowns on your head and march you around the gospel 3 times. Of course, they do change rings at the back of the church. But no questions are being answered. No real teaching is to understand how marriage and children are part of our salvation, because unselfish love and co-suffering love are the things that give us inner transformation, that transform our hearts and our souls. When you have children, you give your life for them. So that's what we call co-suffering love. You suffer together with your children. You say, when we had our marriage clinics here at the monastery, I thought about, well, what if we sing the hymns of martyrdom when we do the cross procession or the gospel? Well, because first of all, you have to martyr your ego for marriage to work. You have to martyr yourself. That's not, I mean, I'll go on to explain the rest of it because martyrios is witness. But I want to make that point that when you sing the hymn of martyrdom around, to stop and think what in yourself you have to martyr for this marriage to work. What do you have to sacrifice for this relationship to be fruitful and bear the fruit of genuine love? And the greatest accomplishment, in my opinion, the greatest accomplishment that a human being can make is to have a marriage that lasts until the end and to raise honest, sincere children. I don't even say God-fearing because that's a loaded phrase. But if you raise healthy, honest children, there's nothing that is a greater accomplishment than that in life. And the fact that it can manifest this unselfish love is a part of our salvation, a part of our redemption. We've got to the point where almost a purity cult, you know. If you have you fulfill all these moral codes and moral laws, that'll accomplish everything for you. And this is a theme that I call him my papa sometimes, John Romanides, used to say that the only way to defeat the power of Satan in your life, in the life of your family, in the life of your parish, is by growth in unselfish love. And that is in the essence of marriage. but it's not what's being taught. It's being taught it's okay to have sex now, it wasn't okay yesterday. And that's why, screaming about same-sex marriage, because everybody thinks in terms of sex. We're obsessed with it. We have a sick obsession with it. And consequently, it pollutes our understanding of marriage itself. I mean, the essence of this union between husband and wife, I guess, type of Christ in the church. And Christ is not just the bridegroom of the church or the overseer of the church. He's the manifestation of God's co-suffering love in the church. She's his bride because he has co-suffering love for her, unselfish love for her. And the main thing that God really asks of us is that we accept his love. Just that we accept his love and let it transform us inside. To look at Christ on the cross, what do we see? Christ with his arms outstretched to all mankind, to all humanity, to encompass them in the greatest act of unselfish love imaginable, that the immortal one comes down and tastes mortality because of his co-suffering love for mankind. In the Garden of Gethsemane, why did he weep? Why did he weep blood? Because he was taking on himself the burdens of mankind's passions and sins. To remember that the word passion means suffering, it doesn't mean sin. Inner human suffering is part of what we have to deal with in life. One Orthodox association, we're talking about what are the proper punishments you should give in confession. So punishments in confession. The church is a spiritual hospital. You're not supposed to be prosecuting attorneys. You're supposed to be spiritual healers. And in confession, you're to help people find solutions, not punish them, not self-atonement, but to help them find solutions in it. So even confession as a time of reconciliation, seeking solutions, and finding inner strength from the church to struggle against your inner human suffering. We're always thinking about sin in some kind of prurient way. We're not thinking about inner human suffering that we're trying to heal in the church. We're not remembering that the church sends no one to heaven or hell, but only prepares people for their final encounter with the river of fire, the love and glory of Jesus Christ, and that our conscience, faced with that vision of that love and glory, are going to judge us and condemn us. So in this life, what are we struggling for? Purity? No, we're struggling to bring our heart and our conscience into accord with one another and to purify ourselves. And marriage is a part of that. Baptism is a part of that. The blessing of homes is a part of that. But these things should be discussed in synods. We should be polling around the world. How are you people understanding the sacraments of the church? How are you applying them? What understanding, what meaning do you give to them? Is confession for punishment, or is confession for healing and trying to find solutions? So we have all these disparities, which are not diversities, they're divisions, and mental and spiritual divisions in the church. So, well, okay, allow for diversity because we don't need absolute conformity. Not every culture is going to accept Greco-Roman principles, but a common understanding in the spiritual life of the church that has to be discussed periodically by these holy synods that come together and not discuss. We used to have a saying when I was at seminary, at Jordanville Seminary, the Russian seminary, you learned why you use, how to use a censer, how to use kadilica. At St. Vladimir's, you learn why you use a censer. At Holy Cross, you learn how to raise money to buy a really nice censer. That was, and that's the kind of thing that we understood, that they had these not diversity, the Russian way of serving, the Greek way of serving, Serbian way of serving, but diversities in understanding and comprehension about the faith and the meaning of the faith and how it should be applied to people, and why we have to change the way we apply it and change the way some of our even religious attitudes are because of the transformation and the continued evolution of the human brain. The brain is evolving slowly. Younger generation sometimes don't even understand what we're saying when we talk to them. We don't understand what they're saying because they're speaking a different dialect than we are, even though we're speaking English. And to respond to all of this, I mean, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but I can't overemphasize. We need to have synods at which experts are there to guide us and speak to us so that we can resolve these problems in a meaningful way and not with a bunch of slogans. That's okay. That's probably all I have to say. I know it's repetition too much, but these things are really important. They're vital to us.
No, Your Eminence is it's always really fruitful, listening to you. I have to admit it was a very bold presentation. You don't listen to such things very often from a hierarch. I think if it was just one phrase to sum up, because I'll have some comments as well, and we have a couple of questions for you, just 20 minutes more, but really briefly talk about what you've been discussing. I will stay in one phrase, which I think underlines everything you've said, and the need for synodality, which actually the understanding that is the diversity we have. So you said that people want answers, they don't want slogans.
Yeah.
And I cannot find a more relevant phrase than this one, what we've been experiencing. Then you've mentioned you said clearly that this, if this has to be, if we have to find an innovative method of this innovation. Should not be seen as a threat always. And you underlined Pope Francis that he said to include lay people more broadly, emphasizing also the role of women. Just to state that, I recall in the Evangelii Gaudium said that in the dialogue with our Orthodox brothers and sisters, we Catholics have the opportunity to learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and their experience of synodality. And this also became a fact because it was a volume from the Roman Catholic Church titled Listening to the East, Synodality in Eastern and Oriental Orthodox Church Traditions, that brought together the proceedings of conferences with that conviction that the journey of synodality undertaken by the Catholic Church is and must be ecumenical.
Yeah.
Just as the ecumenical journey is synodal. And then you try to give a picture, because one question has to do about orthodoxy clearly. So we said we don't have, this synodality we have is not that effective. Even understanding of the sacraments from lay people differs from location to location. And then you emphasize the obvious, which is listening to the experts. And you mentioned that example also in Boston. And yes, one other things that I've underlined here, that the religion of America is America, and I would like to say more things about it. So we struggle to keep this Christianity alive. So you probably mentioned we need to understand in every location and to rebuild our own Orthodox understanding. You also mentioned that traditionalism is one of our problems, that it prevents us to understand the reality we live in.
Yeah.
And lastly, you gave this beautiful example of the unselfish love, making this confession about marriage till the end and to raise children. This one of the greatest accomplishment of life. And you mentioned this unselfish love example. And I will agree with you, if I may also take if I can give my personal opinion on that yeah, you're right, people are seeking for solutions to their problems. we don't hear this human suffering. And not only, in the church, many times I find also myself in front of documents, theological documents. We have a tendency to forget people, human.
Yeah.
So
we have a repertoire of platitudes. We have a long repertoire of platitudes. No matter what somebody asks us, we have a platitude. We don't have an answer, but we have a platitude.
Yeah. So the question that we have here in our channel is that what is the conciliar awareness among the Orthodox in the US, and what is their ecumenical inter-Christian consciousness? So intra-Christian synodality, not only among Orthodox.
Well, it's like when I have the Ethiopians, of course, coming this Saturday, and the Coptic people come up 4 times a year, inevitably someone's going to say, "Oh, they're heretics. How can let them come to your monastery?" This kind of mentality. Do you know what heresy means? It means an opinion. You think you have the wrong opinion. Doesn't mean you're going to burn somebody at stake. Doesn't mean you're going to cast them out or not recognize the image and likeness of God in them, in their humanity, and the fact that they love Christ, that they're striving toward Christ, that they're striving for a spiritual life in Christ. And really, I'm not too sure that God still sweats the Fourth Ecumenical Council. It's a pity we didn't accept the Henoticon, but Emperor Zenon and the Patriarch had come up, the Henoticon was a reconciliation, but it didn't come to pass. But the fact that there was a Henoticon, that there was a reconciliation at the time that was made public and possible, means of course it's still there. And you have to have average Coptic person. Are you a monophysite? What? What's that? Nobody knows what these things even mean anymore. What is a filioque? Okay, it's better you didn't change the symbol of faith once it was established. But in the beginning, when the filioque cropped up, okay, some of the people in the East thought, this is going to result in such and such a heresy. People in the West says, no, this is going to prevent such and such a heresy. Heresy didn't develop. It's more than 1,000 years later, and heresy didn't develop. So why keep flogging the dead horse? Because it is a dead horse. It's nice if we can all say the symbol of faith without the filioque, but the filioque did not create a heresy, as they thought it might. So forget it. Forget it. We have bigger fish to fry than that now. We have more important things to talk about. And nothing can be ecumenical anymore unless it involves Rome and Constantinople both. And the root of any kind of ecumenical manifestation has to begin between Constantinople and Rome. It can expand from that. But I don't see any reason why I shouldn't pray together with these Coptic people when they come here. I say the blessing for the food. I suppose that's a heresy to bless the food for monophysites. But these are such pious, loving people. And the Coptic Church is a garden of martyrs in our day. These people are being constantly martyred in their society and their culture. And we can't recognize their martyrdom. We can't recognize their sacrifice, their witness. They're witnessing for Christ. They're not witnessing for I forget one of the great monophysites, but they're not witnessing for him. They're witnessing for Jesus Christ. And we have to accept that witness. And I'm going to just repeat. I said this on National Public Radio once and got out a hemorrhage of vitriol. The Nativity of Christ is not the birth of a magic baby in Bethlehem. The Nativity of Christ is the incarnation of God's co-suffering love for mankind. And that's where redemption begins. Christ, why did God become man? because in Christ, the human nature and the divine nature are fully united, not blended, but united together. In Christ, the alienation between God and man has been resolved. And that's our redemption. We're redeemed from our alienation from God. And in the person of Jesus Christ, the resolution of that, the redemption from that alienation takes place, because there is no alienation between the two, between the human and the divine in Christ. Consequently, he's bringing that into our humanity and showing us the way to resolve that alienation. So what is our struggle? Our struggle isn't to be morally perfect. Our struggle is to no longer be alienated from God, to overcome that alienation. If we overcome that alienation, everything will come out as it should. You know, this great and wondrous thing we've been given, that we can participate in God's nature. But we're so worried about, see, true morality consists far more in how well we care for one another than what kind of behavior we demand of each other. And somebody asked me, well, what's holiness? Well, these holiness movements. Holiness, the beginning of holiness, is just to treat everybody around you decently. That's the beginning of holiness. It's not swinging knots. You know, I can swing knots all day. Say 1,000 knots on your prayer rope. Oh, why not kick 1,000 cans or pick up 1,000 sticks? Swinging knots and counting. You're not praying. You're saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, because you want to make sure you get the 1,000 in. And some of these things even need to be discussed. When I'm in Greece, it's sort of a fad to have an elder on Mount Athos. Now, something I learned already in the 70s when I was a deacon. Men are more susceptible to these wild prayer rules than women are. So men goes to his elder on Mount Athos. He comes back. Bedtime, nighttime, he's supposed to have 1,000 knots on his prayer rope and say a canon or an akaphist, completely neglecting his wife and his conjugal duties. Women actually become jealous of God when the husband's going to perform all these things at bedtime and totally ignore her. And then some monk will say, oh, they shouldn't have any kind of sexual relations unless you're specifically planning to procreate a child. And we've got one of these magic elders here in North America. And don't take off all your clothes when you have sex and try not to enjoy it. We have, in North America, we have one monastic group. He's teaching people how to make a flagellum to flagellate himself when he has sexual temptations toward his wife in Lent. But flagellation is just a form of masturbation. It's a very sexual act. And yeah, all these things are being taught here and there, and no one is discussing in general what are the limits on the extremism of spiritual life. Sometimes you can destroy people by giving them a certain kind of prayer rule. You can deprive them of quality time with their family, with their children and wives, if they're following these extreme prayer rules. And they're all aimed, what is the center of them? They're all focused on sex. There's a sick obsession with that subject. And most of the struggle, the spiritual struggle and stuff, are aimed at that, even in marriage. And that's, you know, even look at Apostle Paul. Don't defraud each other except by mutual consent for times of fasting and prayer. Don't defraud each other except by mutual consent for times of fasting and prayer. And we're telling men to flagellate themselves, beat themselves on the back till they're bloody or something, to keep from having sexual relations with their wife, with their own wife. We've got to resolve, okay, what now? You look at Apostle Paul, thank God, we know Apostle Paul did not write 1 Timothy. We know that for certain now, because it'd be far too misogynistic for Paul. But there's a couple of questionable things in 1 Thessalonians, which are probably interpolations from the Greco-Roman culture. But a lot of things that Apostle Paul said, Apostle Paul was anticipating the end of the world in his own lifetime. These were apocalyptic prescriptions. And some of the things that early ecumenical councils dissolving also had this apocalypticism in mind. So some of these are, even some things in Pauline epistles are predicated on the fact that in maybe 10 years, the world won't exist anymore. See, but mind you, it never says the end of the world, it says the end of the age. We're talking about ages now, even in the symbol of faith, the age to come. But we have to stop and think, well, okay, if this kind of denigration of marriage sometimes in the early church wasn't because marriage was unclean or because sexual relations in marriage were unclean, it was because you wanted to prepare yourself for the imminent end of the world, for the imminent apocalypse. Well, eschatology, I should say, not apocalypse, but for the eschato. And I think, do we still have to live as if we thought the world was going to come to an end next year? Instead of growing and developing in this life in which we are living now and receiving the things that God has given us and opening ourselves to accept the co-suffering love of God. Or you look at the cross, why did Anselm come up with this goofy Cor Deus Homo in the context of the dialectic of the Roman law court, and really in the context of medieval law for dueling? Because Christ is going to be a human sacrifice to satisfy God's wrath and anger. But to understand that God became man to manifest God's suffering love for mankind, to gather the flock back into the sheepfold. He didn't come for any kind of punishment or destruction or harm. He came to manifest the co-suffering love of God for mankind. And what we should be striving for in our spiritual life is not to say, oh, I said 1,000 prayer robes. My elder said this, my elder said that. Learn to love one another with an unselfish love. Learn that the message of Christ on the cross, I remember Fotis Kandaglu called the icon of the cross the canonical icon, the peaceful one. And Kandaglu called it the icon of the peace and hope of death in Christ Jesus. That's what Kandaglu called it.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm launching into
No. Just yeah, to return, because I told you
these things have to be discussed in synods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you know what? This is also a finding. We've been discussing about the synod and the fact that we should not strive, to imprison the gospel in the past, but to proclaim it in the light of a new knowledge, and new understandings, if you want. And we're discussing about everyday life issues or questions. I would like to call it problems. But still, you mentioned in your lecture that we have to re-examine, the state of our own synodality. And since you've mentioned earlier before this Greco-Roman culture, this will be the last question. And this Greco-Roman culture, but with a Christian veneer, something that you emphasize many times also in your texts. So the question and the point, so we know, for example, that Christianity, so despite the spread of Christianity and some significant changes, of course, brought to the society, there were the elements of this Greco-Roman culture that persisted, right, and were many times intertwined with Christian practices and beliefs. We have many examples, in the past, like the works of ancient Greek Norman philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, that continue to be studied, and some early Christian thinkers like Augustine of Hippo. They integrated classical philosophy in their writings. So my point in the question is that because there were also some legal principles that continue to play the significant role in governance in Christianity in the earlier times. So generally, in which extent nowadays the political structures and please try to respond as briefly as you can. I know it's very difficult, but yeah. So in which extent nowadays the political structures are influencing the Christian structure, and
Yes.
how we can implement moral and ethical values within the society, but through a synodal process. In other words, also how can lay people can be involved, if they should be involved.
Yeah. That's, that's it. No, I'll go to America. Abba Austin Popovich was always complaining that Serbian politics was inflicted on the church. But in America, there is, Donald Trump has just released a MAGA Bible, a special Bible. There is actually the belief among evangelicals that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were dictated directly by God. You mentioned John Locke, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, all these people who really had input into it. And they said, who? What? No, it was dictated directly by God. So these things have to be part of our religion, part of our faith. And they will defend the Constitution more than they would defend the symbol of faith, But the other thing that is a little bit troubling, everybody, on the walls of courthouses and police stations in America, we don't have it here, but they have the 10 Commandments on the walls. Nobody ever posted the Beatitudes. The 10 Commandments are basically insipid. They don't really say anything that had been said by Hammurabi and by Pharaoh Joster centuries before. But Jesus Christ gave us the Beatitudes, and we don't pay attention to the Beatitudes. I know the Greeks don't, but we, in the Slavic tradition, we sing the Beatitudes in every liturgy. And you tell me, forget about the 10 Commandments, look at the Beatitudes. See? Actually, the 10 Commandments allow for henotheism anyway, but it doesn't say there are no other gods, just don't have any of them before me. But everyone wants law. The Beatitudes are not law, they're not legislation, so we have to ignore them. They're the ladder that we would climb toward what holiness really is, what a life in Christ really is, what a life of Orthodox Christian spiritual existence really is. But nobody's promoting the Beatitudes. They're promoting law, Old Testament law, some of the worst Old Testament law, and some of the law that you can define from Apostle Paul. We have to read Apostle Paul through the lens of Jesus Christ. We don't read Jesus Christ through the lens of Apostle Paul. Technically speaking, Jesus Christ is superior to Apostle Paul. So the Beatitudes are our social program. The Beatitudes are what Christ gave us. The moral imperatives of Jesus Christ are simple and straightforward. Love one another as I've loved you. Have empathy for your neighbor, which is what loving your neighbors yourself really means. And have love among yourself, and people will know you're my disciples if you love one another. And strive to live a moral life that somehow incorporates the Beatitudes into it. And so I have to remember that what behavior we demand of other people can be just a form of repression. How well we care for each other is the real measure of morality. Not what kind of repression we can pose on other people and pretend that we're doing it ourselves, but not actually. Celibacy is a word with a great deal of relativity to it. It's relative to, that's why you have married priests in Africa. They have to be, because their culture and their society can't cope with celibate priests. It's abnormal, it's unnatural. So, we talk about there's no such thing as natural law, because nature doesn't feel the least bit of compulsion to obey it. I mean, we're legislating, nature says, phooey, I mean, I have no obligation to obey your idea of natural law. And besides, we're overturning the principles of Thomas Aquinas' ideas of natural theology all the time anyway. I mean, that's one of the divisions, natural theology or revealed theology. You know, that's what we don't kind of stop to think of. Theoria, okay, it's a Greek term. It means contemplation, basically. The philosophers used it. A theoria for us is contemplation and revelation, a deep contemplation of the realities in the spiritual life, expecting revelation, because we're doing this contemplation in a deep form of prayer, and we're not taking for granted that what our eyes see is completely reality. But even there, you know, that's why St. Gregory warned us that not everybody's supposed to theologize. Not everybody, my brothers, should theologize, but only those, you know. He gives the criteria for people who should not theologize. And let's forget St. John Chrysostom in his sermon on the Nativity of Christ, or the sermon on the Sunday before, I should say, the sermon on the genealogy, divides it into 14 parts. Each one is a different form of government, earthly government. And it says, under no form of government were we the better or the worse. So forget about the government. We were not better or worse under any of them. So, you know, it's, and we give these platitudes, okay, what's scriptural, biblical family life, biblical marriage? There's not one family in the Bible I'd want to live next door to, especially if I have a wife who liked to sunbathe on the roof. You know, she was, so we have to look, we're expecting something better and something higher, even than what's in the scripture. And what's better and what's higher are the moral imperatives of Jesus Christ and the Beatitudes. And, you know, monastics are used to think, oh, we have the great angelic habit. We're the Illuminati, or I should say it in more correct terms, they're the auditori and we're the perfecti. Because so much of that is just Manichaean. You know, the idea that people who are married and raise children are the auditori and we are the perfecti. No, that's monasticism is not higher than marriage. You know, maybe it's a path of salvation. It can also be a path of egotism and self-focus. But at least in marriage, you're distracted by your children making noise, having to change diapers, having to get up at 3 a.m, your wife having to go through menopause, and you know, that's and then we say, oh, women can't take. See, this is part of Greco-Roman culture, the denigration of women. Women are imperfect men. And someone asked Chrysostom, I can't remember where he answered it, if menstruation made a woman unclean. And he says, certainly not. The only thing that makes one unclean is an evil disposition, not something that occurs naturally. I said, well, okay, maybe PMS, maybe that gives her an evil disposition. But not
unfortunately, yeah, the time has passed, and we have to rush a bit. We have to close our today's discussion. But I would like really cordially to thank you for the very insightful presentation regarding this rebirth, or the need of the rebirth of synodality.
Yeah.
And wishing you a blessed Lent.
Well, thank you, and God keep you. And Pascha's what, 3 weeks?
Yes,
no?
Exactly.
Yes, I've got to prepare something for the entry into Jerusalem. I think it's greatly not understood why Solomon rode a mule to Gihon to be consecrated by Nathan and Zadok the priest. Why Christ rode a mule into Jerusalem when Solomon built the temple. Christ came to purge the temple and restore our understanding of what it meant. So the two have to be tied together. You can't have them apart. Anyway,
thank you. Really, thank you very much. I would like to thank you also our audience, and You have also the appreciation and thanks from Professor Petros Vassiliadis, the honorary president of CEMES, and of all CEMES Executive Committee for your presentation and for answering questions. So to our dear guests also, so we have to renew our appointment after May, after the Easter. So that's all. Wishing you a pleasant evening, Your Eminence. Once more.
I want to point out one thing, by the way. You'll see there's a painting on my wall back there. You might be able to see it clearly, but it's a painting of a astrolite cell firing in the brain that somebody did especially for me. And I think that's important. I think it's theologically important. I think it's spiritually important. So anyway.
This is true. So, okay, thank you. And to all have a pleasant evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Να είστε καλά.